Let me tell you about the day I became a Duchess. Scotland, 1806. It was not the fairy tale my younger self had imagined during long Irish summers, reading novels by candlelight. When Duke Frank Alexander of Inverath placed that ring, heavy, cold, beautiful, on my finger, he did not smile. He did not meet my eyes. He simply fulfilled his obligation, and I, in turn, fulfilled mine. What neither of us realized, standing in that ancient cathedral, was that duty can be a dangerous beginning, because the woman who accepts it may one day redefine it entirely. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We did love to hear from you. If you enjoy Victorian-era tale stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Scotland, 1806. A reverent silence descended upon St. Giles's Cathedral as Duke Frank Alexander of Inverath entered through the ancient oak doors, his presence commanding the assembled nobility without a single word. Lady Vivian Donovan watched from her position near the altar, her gloved hands clasped before her with deliberate composure. This man, whose name carried the weight of centuries and whose estate stretched across the Highlands, had become the architect of her family's salvation and her own uncertain future. Unlike the other young ladies who had pursued the Duke with transparent ambition, Vivian maintained her stillness, a figure of controlled grace despite the tremor of anxiety beneath her emerald silk gown. She stood beside her father, Lord Edward Donovan, an Irish nobleman whose honor far exceeded his diminished fortune, the spectre of debtors' prison hovering like a ghost over their family name. "Hold fast, daughter," her father murmured, his voice raw with suppressed emotion. "The Duke expects strength, not sentiment." Vivian's pulse quickened as Frank Alexander moved down the cathedral aisle with measured, purposeful strides. At 34, he possessed the kind of austere authority that made men step aside and women lower their eyes. Tall and powerfully built, with storm-grey eyes and dark hair touched with silver at the temples, he was as formidable as the Scottish winter itself. "Lord Donovan," the Duke acknowledged with the barest incline of his head before turning his attention to Vivian. "Lady Vivian." His gaze swept over her with clinical assessment, as though examining a treaty requiring his signature. Vivian lifted her chin, refusing to shrink beneath his scrutiny. "Your Grace," she replied, her voice steadier than her heartbeat. "I am prepared." "Then let us proceed," he said, gesturing toward the altar where the bishop waited, robed and solemn. As they took their positions before God and witnesses, Vivian sensed the weight of Scotland's aristocracy upon them. The Duke's reputation preceded him, ruthlessly efficient in estate management, diplomatically invaluable to the crown, and notably unmarried despite his duty to produce an heir. At 34, he had resisted every matchmaking scheme until necessity had brought him to her father's door. "I shall be direct, Lady Vivian," Frank had said during their only private conversation 3 weeks prior, in her father's modest library. "I require a wife of suitable breeding and unquestionable reputation. Your father has made clear your family's circumstances. I offer security in position. In return, I expect competence, discretion, and an heir." Vivian had absorbed his words like blows, each one stripping away another girlish hope. "And affection, Your Grace?" she had asked, her mother's tender marriage still vivid in her memory. "Might that be possible?" Something had shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been regret or perhaps impatience, before the granite mask returned. "I make no promises beyond the practical. If these terms satisfy your father's concerns, we shall sign the settlement by week's end." Now, as the bishop began the ancient rites, Vivian stood in that same cathedral where Scottish kings had once been crowned, becoming the Duchess of Inverath in a ceremony attended by the most powerful families in Scotland. Her gown of forest green velvet with cream chantilly lace drew murmurs of approval, but beneath its elegant draping, her heart struggled against a rising tide of loneliness. Frank recited his vows with the precision of a military officer delivering orders, clear, correct, and completely devoid of warmth. When he placed the wedding band upon her finger, a stunning gold ring set with Highland cairngorms, his touch was brief and impersonal, his expression as unchanged as the stone walls surrounding them. The moment Frank Alexander of Inverath placed the ring on Vivian Donovan's finger, he did not smile. The vows were spoken, the ancient words echoing off vaulted ceilings that had witnessed centuries of such unions. Some forged in love, most in strategy. As Frank withdrew his hand and turned fractionally away, adjusting his ceremonial sword, Vivian understood with crystalline clarity. This was not a beginning. This was a transaction, now complete. And yet, as the bishop pronounced them man and wife, as the congregation rose in rustling acknowledgement, Vivian made a silent vow of her own, one that had nothing to do with obedience and everything to do with survival. If she was to be a duchess in name only, she would become a duchess indeed. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of forced congratulations and calculating stares. By evening, Vivian found herself in a gilded carriage bound for Inverath Castle, seated across from a husband who had not spoken to her since they left the cathedral steps. As the Scottish Highlands rose dark and imposing against the twilight sky, she realized her true wedding night would not be one of passion, but of cold assessment. And somewhere in the ancestral, halls awaiting her arrival, a life she had never imagined, and a power she had never sought, was about to begin. Inverath Castle rose from the Highland mist like a monument to isolation itself, all grey stone and narrow windows, more fortress than home. As the carriage clattered across the ancient bridge spanning a ravine of jagged rock, Vivian felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders. The servants assembled in the great hall greeted her with respectful curtsies and bows, but their eyes held something else entirely, curiosity edged with judgment. Another woman entering these walls. Let us see how long this one lasts. Mrs. Murray will show you the household arrangements, Frank said, his tone as businesslike as if addressing a new steward. I have correspondence requiring attention. We dine at 8. He turned on his heel and disappeared down a corridor lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, leaving Vivian standing alone in the cavernous entrance. The tour was efficient, cold. Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper, showed her the drawing rooms, the library, the conservatory, all immaculate, all untouched by warmth. Finally, they reached the ducal apartments, his chambers on one side of a connecting door, hers on the other. His Grace rarely uses the connecting door, Your Grace, Mrs. Murray said, her voice carefully neutral. He prefers not to be disturbed. That first night, Vivian lay awake in the massive 4-poster bed, watching the connecting door by candlelight. It never opened. The second night, she blew out the candle earlier. By the third week, she no longer looked at the door at all. Their marriage remained unconsummated, a fact that must surely be whispered about in the servants' quarters. At meals, Frank was punctiliously polite, inquiring after her comfort, commenting on the weather, but his grey eyes never truly focused on her. He might as well have been dining with a portrait. The south wing requires new tapestries. She ventured one evening, testing whether he cared about her observations. Consult with Mrs. Murray, he replied, cutting his venison with surgical precision. I trust your judgment on domestic matters. Domestic matters. She had been reduced to curtains and menus. The hurt burrowed deep, a constant ache beneath her composure. She had expected coldness, yes, but not this systematic erasure, this careful relegation to the margins of his life. Some nights, alone in her pristine prison of silk and mahogany, disappointment threatened to overwhelm her entirely, but Vivian was her mother's daughter, and her mother had taught her, Dignity is the last thing they can take from you. She would not beg. She would not plead. She would not make herself smaller, hoping he might finally notice her. Instead, on a grey morning in her second month at Inverath, Vivian rose before dawn, dressed in a simple walking gown, and made a decision that would alter everything. If she had been denied a husband, she would master the role of Duchess. The castle held secrets. It was time she learned them all. Vivian began in the library, where decades of estate ledgers lined the shelves like soldiers at attention. She started with the most recent year, running her finger down columns of expenditures and revenues, her father's training in household accounts suddenly invaluable. The numbers told stories the castle's polished surfaces concealed. "Your Grace," Mr. Bancroft, the estate steward, stood in the doorway 3 mornings later, his expression hovering between confusion and affront. "I was not informed you required the tenant agreements. I did not realize I needed permission to understand my own household," Vivian replied evenly, not looking up from the contract before her. "This lease, the McGregor farm, the terms seem unusually harsh." Bancroft's jaw tightened. "Those terms have been standard for 30 years, Your Grace." 30 years, Vivian repeated softly. "And the yield requirements?" "Unchanged. Despite the soil exhaustion noted here in the land surveys." She tapped the relevant passage. "Unchanged terms on declining land. How traditional." The steward retreated, but Vivian had seen the flash of resentment in his eyes. Mrs. Murray proved more forthcoming, perhaps because Vivian asked rather than demanded. "The servants' quarters. Mrs. Murray, when were they last renovated?" The housekeeper's pause spoke volumes. "The western wing. Not in my tenure, Your Grace. Near 40 years, I'd wager." Vivian inspected them herself, ignoring the shocked whispers. Crumbling plaster. Windows that wouldn't close. In December. The contrast with the castle's grandeur was obscene. She found worse in the tenant cottages she visited on horseback, chaperoned by a bewildered stable hand. Families of 6 in 2-room structures. Children coughing in the cold. Wages that hadn't increased despite rising costs of grain and cloth. "His Grace prefers not to interfere with traditional arrangements," one tenant said carefully, cap in weathered hands. "Traditional?" Vivian thought, her composure masking white-hot anger. Another word for invisible. She began small, a discreet word to the carpenter about servant quarters. Instructions to Mrs. Murray to distribute warmer blankets from the castle's overstocked linen rooms. A quiet adjustment to kitchen purchasing, buying directly from tenant farms at fairer prices rather than through expensive Glasgow merchants. Frank noticed nothing. He remained absorbed in correspondence with Edinburgh and London, departing for days at a time on Crown business. When present, he acknowledged her at meals with the same distant courtesy, never asking how she spent her days. But in the servants' hall, over evening meals Frank never witnessed, a different conversation was beginning. "She asked about my daughter's cough," one housemaid whispered. "Sent the physician to the McGregor farm," another added. "Didn't ask permission, just did it." Old Mrs. Murray, pouring tea, allowed herself the ghost of a smile. "She is not like the others," the housekeeper said quietly. "This one sees us." By January, Vivian's careful reforms became impossible to ignore. The servant quarters were rebuilt, limestone and proper timber replacing rotting wood. A rotation system ensured no staff worked 16-hour days during winter. The estate physician, previously reserved for the Duke's occasional headaches, now made weekly rounds to tenant farms. And in the old gamekeeper's cottage, now scrubbed and whitewashed, 12 tenant children gathered 3 mornings a week while a young Edinburgh teacher Vivian had quietly hired taught them letters and sums. "This is irregular, Your Grace," Mr. Bancroft protested, standing rigid in the library. "The expenses are detailed here," Vivian said, sliding the ledger across the desk. and justified. But it was Frank who finally confronted her, returned from a fortnight in Edinburgh to find his estate transformed in ways that reached even his distracted notice. The household accounts have increased significantly. He stood in the doorway of her sitting room, the ledger in hand, his expression unreadable. You've taken considerable liberties. Vivian set down her embroidery, meeting his grey eyes steadily. I've taken necessary actions. Without consultation. You were unavailable for consultation, Your Grace, and the matters were pressing. Frank's jaw tightened. Explain. She did, methodically. The housing that violated basic human dignity. The wages that hadn't adjusted for inflation in 3 decades. The preventable illnesses costing both lives and labor. The children who would remain illiterate and thus useless for anything but the most menial work. And the education scheme. His voice was dangerously quiet. An investment, Vivian said firmly. Literate tenants manage land better, keep better records, innovate. Your estates in Perthshire already demonstrate this. I found the reports in your study. I simply applied your own principles. Silence stretched between them. Frank studied her as if seeing her for the first time. Truly seeing her, not as an obligation fulfilled, but as a force requiring reckoning. The efficiency improvements, he asked finally. Direct farm purchasing eliminated the Glasgow middlemen, saving 12%. The healthier workforce reduced crop losses by nearly 20% this harvest. The numbers are all there. He glanced at the ledger again, and something shifted in his expression, not warmth precisely, but a grudging recognition. Proceed, he said at last, but do not exceed reason. I never do, Your Grace. After he left, Vivian allowed herself to breathe. She had not asked for permission, she had not apologized, and he had granted her something more valuable than affection. Power. Quiet, undeniable power. Outside her window, Invereth Castle stood unchanged in the winter dusk. But within its walls, everything was beginning to shift. Tenants whispered gratitude, servants moved with new purpose, and a neglected Duchess was becoming something her husband had never anticipated. Indispensable. News traveled through the highlands like wind through heather, swift, persistent, impossible to contain. By spring, Invereth's transformation had become the subject of drawing-room conversations from Edinburgh to Inverness. Letters arrived daily, their seals bearing the crests of neighbouring estates. The Countess of Sutherland requested Vivian's advice on tenant education. Lord Murray of Athol inquired about her agricultural reforms. Even the Lord Advocate wrote, praising her modern sensibilities applied to ancient traditions. We're hosting a gathering, Vivian informed Frank at breakfast, her tone allowing no debate. Saturday fortnight. Regional lairds and their families. It's time Invereth demonstrated its hospitality. Frank lowered his newspaper, studying her. I have correspondence. Which can wait, Vivian said pleasantly. Your presence is required, Your Grace. Not optional. Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, at being commanded in his own home, but he nodded curtly. The gathering transformed Invereth's great hall. Candlelight gleamed off polished silver, musicians played in the gallery, and Scotland's nobility filled the ancient space with conversation and laughter. Vivian moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her emerald silk gown catching the light, her presence magnetic in ways that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with substance. Your Grace, Lord Fraser said warmly, capturing her hand. My tenants speak of nothing but your education initiative. Revolutionary, truly. Merely practical, Vivian demurred. An estate's strength lies in its people's capability. From across the room, Frank watched this exchange, then another, then a third. He was present, impeccably dressed, formally correct, but he might as well have been furniture. The conversations flowed around him, not to him. The Duchess of Invereth, Lady MacLeod declared to a cluster of women, her voice carrying, has accomplished in 6 months what most men cannot in 6 years. Intelligence married to compassion, rare in any station, remarkable in one so young. Frank's hand tightened imperceptibly around his whiskey glass. The evening's pinnacle came when the Lord Justice Clerk, the Crown's representative, took Frank aside. "Your wife, Westfield, exceptional woman. The Crown has noticed her work. Stability, innovation, loyalty among the tenantry. Precisely what Scotland needs in these uncertain times. Your wife, not your estate. Not your reforms." Frank's response was measured, automatic. But as he watched Vivian across the room, surrounded by admirers, laughing at some witticism, utterly in command, a profound discomfort settled over him. He had married a wife to bear his name and manage his household. Somehow, without his permission or awareness, she had become the Duke of Inverath in all but title, and he, the actual Duke, had become a spectator in his own life. Frank left for Edinburgh 3 days after the gathering, citing military consultations with the Secretary of War, then Glasgow for trade negotiations, then London for Crown business. His absences stretched from days to weeks, his letters brief and devoid of personal inquiry. "The estate prospers under your management. Proceed as you see fit." Vivian flourished in his absence. Invitations multiplied, dinners, assemblies, consultations with ladies' reform societies. She became a fixture at gatherings where progressive ideas circulated like fine wine. Her opinion sought, her presence anticipated. The Duchess of Inverath was, society agreed, a singular woman. Yet each evening, returning to Inverath's empty halls, the admiration felt hollow. The gossip reached her through Lady MacLeod, who clearly believed she was being kind by preparing Vivian for what everyone already knew. "My dear, I feel I must mention, purely out of concern, that the Duke has been seen frequently in Lady Ashford's company. The widow, you understand. In Edinburgh, at the theatre, twice. Nothing scandalous, I'm sure, but—" Vivian's teacup never trembled. "How thoughtful of you to mention it. She's a handsome woman, of course, and they've known each other for years. Before your marriage, naturally." Naturally. Vivian's smile remained perfectly calibrated. "More tea." Alone in her chambers that night, she permitted herself 5 minutes of stillness, staring at the connecting door that had never opened, feeling the sharp object of rejection twist deeper. He had given her power, yes. Status, certainly. Everything but himself. Lady Ashford, a widow of impeccable breeding and, Vivian had heard, considerable wit. Everything a duke might desire in a companion, with none of the tedious obligations of an actual wife. Vivian could confront him. Demand answers. Play the wounded spouse seeking reassurance. She did none of these things. Instead, she accepted an invitation to speak before the Edinburgh Ladies' Benevolent Society. She implemented a new apprenticeship program for tenant sons. She corresponded with agricultural reformers across Britain. She became more visible, more capable, more admired. If Frank wanted Lady Ashford's sophisticated conversation and undemanding companionship, so be it. Vivian would not beg for scraps of attention from a man who had made his disinterest clear from their wedding day. But late at night, when the castle slept and a public mask could finally slip, a question haunted her. What is the worth of Scotland's admiration if it does not reach the one person who matters? She had no answer, only the cold comfort of duty well executed and the growing certainty that she had won everything except what she truly wanted. The Highland Assembly convened in late summer at Stirling Castle, drawing clan chiefs and nobles from across Scotland for the Crown's annual gathering. Frank attended as duty demanded. Vivian accompanied him because her absence would now be noted. The crisis erupted on the second day. A land dispute between Clan MacDonald and Clan Campbell, ancient enemies with longer memories than reason, threatened to unravel the fragile peace. Voices rose in the great hall, hands moved toward sword hilts, and centuries of bloodshed shimmered just beneath the surface of civility. "Enough!" Frank's voice cut through the chaos, commanding and cold. "The Crown will not tolerate your grace." Vivian's voice, quieter but somehow carrying further, stopped him mid-sentence. She rose from her seat among the ladies, moving forward with unhurried grace. "If I may." The hall fell silent, not from authority, but from sheer surprise. Women did not speak at the assembly, certainly not wives interrupting their husbands. Frank's expression was unreadable, but he stepped aside. Vivian addressed the room, her voice steady and clear. "My lords, I am Irish by birth. I have no clan, no ancient grievances written in blood and stone. Perhaps that makes me unqualified to speak." She paused, meeting the eyes of both clan leaders. "Or perhaps it allows me to see what you cannot. You both have lost sons to this dispute. You both have lands that could prosper through cooperation rather than conflict. You both serve the same crown, worship the same God, and bleed the same red when steel finds flesh." Her voice sharpened. "And you both have daughters who will inherit the consequences of decisions made in pride rather than wisdom." The MacDonald chief shifted uncomfortably. The Campbell laird's jaw tightened. "Scotland's strength has never been in standing alone," Vivian continued. "It has always been in standing together, when we choose to remember it. The Crown asks not for your surrender, but for your leadership. Show your children that honor lies not in perpetuating ancient hatreds, but in building a future worthy of their inheritance." Silence stretched like a drawn breath. Then Lord MacDonald extended his hand. "For the daughters, then." Lord Campbell clasped it. "For Scotland." The tension shattered into murmured agreement, and Vivian returned to her seat as though she had merely commented on the weather. Later, the Lord Advocate found Frank on the castle ramparts. "Your wife, Invereth. Extraordinary. She accomplished with words what would have required the crowned soldiers." He paused meaningfully. "We could use more like her." Frank stood alone long after the man departed, staring at the darkening hills. He had believed power came from title, authority, command, the ability to impose will through position. Vivian had just demonstrated something far more dangerous. Power earned through respect, wielded through grace, and impossible to revoke. Everything he had believed about strength was suddenly, profoundly insufficient. Frank returned to Inverath 3 days after the assembly, but the man who entered the castle was not the same one who had left it. He found Vivian in the library, reviewing proposals for a new school building. She glanced up, her expression politely neutral, the look she had perfected over months of practiced indifference. "Your Grace, I trust Edinburgh was productive. I need to speak with you." His voice was rougher than usual, lacking its customary control. "Not as your husband by law, but as a man who has been profoundly mistaken." Vivian set down her pen slowly. "Mistaken about what, precisely?" "Everything." Frank moved closer, then stopped as though approaching sacred ground without permission. "I married you believing I needed an ornament, a suitable vessel for my name and heir. I thought power meant commanding others to bend to my will. And now," her tone remained carefully even, "now I've watched you transform an estate I've governed for a decade. I've seen hardened clan chiefs yield to your wisdom when they would have drawn steel against my authority. I've heard the Crown's representatives speak your name with more respect than they've ever given mine." He drew a breath. "You are not the wife I thought I needed. You are the partner I was too blind to deserve." Vivian rose, and for the first time in their marriage, genuine anger flickered across her composed features. "How convenient," she said quietly, "that you've noticed my value now that Scotland applauds it. Tell me, Your Grace, Would you be standing here if the assembly had not witnessed my usefulness? If the Lord Advocate had not praised me to your face?" Frank flinched as though struck. "That's not. It is exactly that." Vivian's voice remained steady, but her eyes blazed. "You want me now because others see my worth. Not because you took the time to discover it yourself. Not because you chose to know me as a woman rather than a transaction." "You're right." The admission seemed to cost him. "I have no defense, but I am here now asking for what? Forgiveness? Affection on demand because your pride is finally wounded?" She shook her head. "I will not be collected like another estate improvement, Your Grace. I will not be valued only when witnesses applaud." "Then what do you want from me?" The question hung between them, raw and real. "I want nothing you are not willing to give freely," Vivian said finally. "And I will accept nothing less than what I deserve, which is a husband who chooses me, not one who has been embarrassed into recognition." Frank nodded slowly, understanding settling over him like winter frost. He could not command her heart. He would have to earn it. And for the first time in his disciplined life, he had no strategy for victory, only the unfamiliar territory of genuine humility. The Invereth Harvest Festival had been Vivian's idea, a celebration uniting tenants, servants, and nobility in recognition of the estate's unprecedented prosperity. As guests gathered in the torchlit courtyard, Frank stood not at the center of the dais, but beside it, leaving the prominent position conspicuously empty. When Vivian approached, surprised, he extended his hand. "This is your achievement," he said quietly, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You should stand where you belong." Together, they faced the assembly. Frank's voice carried across the crowd, clear and deliberate. "A year ago, I believed Inverath's strength lay in tradition, in maintaining what had always been. My wife has taught me that true strength lies in having the courage to change what must be changed." He turned to Vivian, his grey eyes holding hers. "Every reform, every innovation, every life improved. This is the Duchess of Inverath's vision made real. Scotland is wiser for her presence, and I am a better man for knowing her." The crowd erupted in applause, but Vivian barely heard it. She saw only Frank. Not the distant duke of their wedding day, but a man offering something far more valuable than pretty words. Genuine recognition, publicly given, with nothing demanded in return. Later, after the festivities quieted and the castle slept, Frank came to her chambers. Not through the connecting door, that would have been presumption, but to her sitting room where he found her by the fire. "May I?" He gestured to the chair opposite. Vivian nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling logs. Then Frank spoke. "I cannot undo the coldness. The months I treated you as an obligation rather than a person. But I can promise you this. If you choose to give me another chance, not as your duke, but as your husband, I will spend the rest of my life proving worthy of it." Vivian studied him, this man who had commanded her presence but never sought her partnership, who had offered security but withheld himself. "I do not need you to worship me, Frank," she said softly, using his name for the first time. "I need you to see me, to choose me daily as I have chosen to build a life here despite your indifference. I see you now." His voice was rough with emotion. "And I choose you, not from duty, not from obligation, but because somewhere in these months of watching you transform everything you touch, I fell in love with the woman I was too blind to notice." Vivian's breath caught. The words she had stopped hoping for offered now with trembling honesty. She reached across the space between them, and Frank took her hand. Truly took it, with warmth and intention and the weight of choice. Their marriage finally began that night, not with vows spoken in cold cathedrals, but with quiet words exchanged by firelight between two people who had learned the difference between duty and devotion. In the years that followed, historians, would note that the Duke of Inverath's estates became models of progressive reform throughout Scotland, but those who knew them understood the truth. Frank had married Vivian out of duty. Scotland had admired her by choice, and he had learned, through the grace of a woman who refused to be diminished, that true power was never claimed, only shared between equals. The connecting door between their chambers, unused for so long, remained open thereafter, not by command, but by invitation, and that, Vivian thought, made all the difference. Dear listeners, thank you for staying with us until the end. If this story moved you, please subscribe, like, comment, and share it with someone close to you. Your support inspires us to keep creating stories filled with love, healing, and unforgettable twists.